Evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. Today is Heritage Day, and we as a people inherit more than a way of dressing, a few traditions. We actually inherit institutions, a legal framework, and ways of being in these institutions and in the world. The story of SAA is a very old one. There was the hedging crisis, then there was Mr. Coleman Andrews, the gentleman who came from the States to restructure it all and didn't do much. Then there were the evergreen contracts, British Aerospace being among them. There were the state capture years under Dudu Myeni, and we inherited a flag carrier, which I'm reflecting in my colors today, that has been lurching from crisis to crisis.
Good evening, Tans and dear viewer. As we all know, in September 2017, SAA began reducing its fleet and cut 23% of its flights to conserve cash and meet the challenge of high input costs. Creditors were knocking at the door of the embattled entity. For SAA, the 2017 was an annus horribilis, basically a year from hell. Standard Chartered Bank was the first bank in June 2017 to call in on its loan. The South African government provided 2.2 billion rands to settle the debt. Citibank was the second bank to refuse to extend a loan facility to SAA. A further 7.7 billion rands became payable at the end of September 2017. National Treasury asked the Public Investment Corporation, which controls government pension funds, for 100 billion rands to help bail out state-owned enterprises, including SAA.
So basically, all the creditors came knocking at the door, and there was not enough money in SAA to meet the demands of the creditors. When money is too tight to mention and payment cannot be made, the debt becomes heavier as interest is levied on the debt.
Oh, what a tale, Tans. On the 5th of December 2019, government announced SAA would enter into bankruptcy protection as the airline had not turned a profit since 2011 and had run out of money. In January 2020, South African Airways announced that it would suspend several routes. The route to Munich, Germany was canned to reduce the financial struggle. In February 2020, the airline introduced its first of 4 newly leased Airbus A350-900s in an attempt to modernize its loss-making long-haul fleet. But could SAA really afford to do this? In April 2020, following a request for further emergency financing due to the 2019-2020 corona pandemic, the South African government announced it would stop funding the airline with immediate effect. The airline then announced plans to lay off all remaining staff by the end of the month. The airline was in effect bankrupt. After troubles with creditors, court cases ensued, and SAA was put under business rescue, and 2 business rescue practitioners were appointed. But on the table had been the new business model and turnaround plan tabled by the much-admired CEO Vuyani Jagana, who exited after he could not secure state support for his plan. It was to be many months and much time and money wasted before some of the ideas that Jagana had tabled earlier.
And now we're told that SAA is now likely to get money from the midterm budget policy statement at the end of October, going directly against previous reassurances coming from National Treasury that it wouldn't be receiving this money. Now, it's said that this happened after the president had chosen the side of the Department of Public Enterprises over National Treasury on the issue. Cabinet that happened this week was crucial to resolving this issue. Now, funding SAA from the fiscus has complex implications. It makes the midterm budget statement even more difficult as a process. So as the process becomes more difficult, because it will be forcing larger cuts onto smaller departments, including reducing infrastructure spend, it makes the National Treasury Department of Public Service and Administration argument in court on the public sector wage bill more untenable, according to Intellidex. And it also sends a worrying signal, investors say, to investors and also to the IMF and the World Bank.
While 10.4 billion rand may not be huge, it is only the start of what is needed in the coming years for the airline, so the government has set itself up on a slippery slope. All this still doesn't ensure success of the new SAA. However, if it doesn't get bank bridge funding, a deal with equity partners cannot be found. The risk that Tito exit occurs is now very high. More profoundly, this shows how decisions can be taken by the presidency without appropriate advice or understanding of the consequences, in our view.
This is also the view of Intellidex in a market intelligence report issued this week. In it, they say that they have always highlighted how Minister Gordon's use of strategy and tactics, both in public and in political life, has meant that the SAA saga would have many twists and turns and would last far longer than expected. However, it is expected that some successful ground would be reached and that the fallout can be contained.
SAA has finally reached a point where it has no cash left, having burnt in recent months through its final 2 billion stockpile. As such, to avoid liquidation, Minister Pravin Gordhan has had to push faster and harder for political direction from the very top.
Now, according to this report released by Intellidex Capital this week, it says that SAA funding from the fiscus has complex implications. It highlights that it makes the medium-term budget process even more complex due to the fact that cuts would have to be made on other spending that was previously planned, and more worrying is the cuts on infrastructure spend. Intellidex further warns that funding also sends a worrying signal to a myriad of investors and creditors. Prudence Makubalo has more.
SAA needs a 10.4 billion rands to restart and will need more funding by the beginning for recapitalization. Government had until last week to announce where the funding would come from, but missed the deadline. SAA BRPs went ahead with a creditors meeting last week. Government says it is still firmly committed to funding the ailing airline and hopes to have a sustainable national carrier post-COVID-19.
Government could well find the money to fund SAA, and indeed in the cabinet meeting today is expected to authorise the 10.4 billion that is required to see it restart. However, we need to consider if there are not better things to spend the money on, in particular infrastructure, which is likely to be cut, jobs programs, particularly the mass employment plan that the president is pushing, which may also be cut, and education and healthcare. So ultimately, it's not going to be about finding the money per se, but the negative impact of having to find that money to fund SAA.
SAA is now likely to get money from medium-term budget policy statement next month, hence going directly against previous reassurances from National Treasury that would not. The Intellidex report says the funding will set government's cash flow on a slippery slope. Last week, business rescue practitioners warned that the airline has reached the point where it has no cash left through end September. It has exhausted its final 2 billion rand stockpile. Hence, to avoid liquidation, government will have to find the funding from banks and strategic equity partner founders or management contract stakeholders. SAA will need additional 14 billion rand by the next to recapitalize of subsidiaries to cover losses in the first 3 fiscal years in the business plan. Intellidex says that this will be a long-term strain on government finances. The airline is also at odds with a COVID recovery plan.
The new SAA that's outlined in the BRP plan is a remarkable thing, really. It's sort of similar. There are a few routes cut here and there, but broadly a very large number of international, regional and domestic routes. It sees basically a 3-year period of losses of about 14 billion rand, which are going to have to be covered from somewhere before the airline returns to some degree of normalcy. But really, it's still probably far too optimistic a plan if we consider the long-term impacts of COVID, the long-term social distancing that is still possible. And we should consider in this plan as well, it's only at best seeing the airline break even in the medium run, let alone actually make a profit. And that's going to be the real challenge between a strategic equity partner who will deal with that situation by cutting routes and employees versus the government who will not want to. And that's, I think, the long-term fight that will go on over any new SAA. And is why, if I were thinking about being a strategic equity partner, would be very, very cautious about going into a deal with the government here.
Over 3,000 South African Airways employees have applied for voluntary severance packages. The number is much higher than anticipated and could lead to the collapse of operations. Now, last month, South African Airways unions accepted an offer for voluntary severance packages for 2,700 workers as part of a proposed rescue plan by the government. Appointed business rescue practitioners as part of the plan. 1,000 employees would be retained to run a new restructured national airline. But now, a total of 3,142 employees have applied for voluntary severance packages, which offer a guaranteed payment of 350,000 rand per employee and up to 2 million rand for pilots. Unions say that the reason for the high number of applications is because workers have not been paid salaries for the past 4 months and are now struggling to survive.
SAA workers in dire straits. They last received salaries back in March. Since then, they've had to rely on a 7,000 rand monthly check from the UIF COVID-19 terrorist scheme. A drop in the ocean for pilots who used to earn around 150,000 rand a month and more. The lowest paid employees used to get 17,000 rand a month on average. Now, almost 70% of the workforce has opted for voluntary severance packages.
That process is being handled by the business rescue practitioners who have to work with the management of SAA and the board and to make sure that workers have an opportunity to properly assess all the opportunities associated with the severance packages.
Voluntary separation guarantees a minimum payout of 350,000 rand per employee. Pilots are each guaranteed a payout of 2 million rand. But the government says it's still working on raising the money.
The processes related to the severance package payments and offers are unfolding. So is the general restructuring of the airline. The department is working flat out to make sure that the process goes relatively smoothly to complete the rescue of SAA. We have brought in transaction advisors who will advise the government as it considers a number of unsolicited expressions of interest from the private sector, people who want to partner up with the new airline. Despite a few challenges that have been there over the past couple of months, there is an indication of a great deal of progress in the process of establishing a new, modern, dynamic airline.
Bongani Muchwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now, just before we went on air and just before we go on with the interviews, we received an email from the spokesperson of the South African Airways, Tlali, saying that the South African Airways is still in business rescue and its administrators are overseeing the process that will enable full implementation of its business rescue plan. A roadmap to restore profitability through restructuring is on the table. The airline has decided to postpone media engagements until matters outstanding and attendant to the business rescue plan have been resolved. And he said that they hope to participate in the future and to take advantage of the opportunity to engage with all the stakeholders and the public about the state of the airline. For more, I'm joined by the NUMSA spokesperson, Phakamile Hlubi-Majola, and the South African Cabin Crew Association President, Zazi Ntsibanyoni-Mugambi. Good evening, ladies. Thank you for joining us. Phakamile is going to be joining us on the line. Let me start with you, Zazi. Zazi, what is the status quo right now? And do you think that SAA will be able to secure the 10.4 billion?
Well, the status quo is that we are still waiting for the money promised by the DPE. We're given assurances that we should expect the 10.4 billion very, very soon, and if not, there'll be some sort of interim funding to let SAA, start or continue to operate or start operating as soon as possible. We're still waiting. We haven't gotten any further feedback from the DPE or government. We are still busy with the Section 189 process, which is well underway. And as we know, over 3,000 employees are currently signing for VSP packages of which they have no idea when they will be paid. And we've written letters to DPE and asked this to the BRPs to say, we cannot expect people to exit this company until such a time they are aware when they can expect to be paid their voluntary severance packages. Because as you know, we didn't oppose it because we were under a lot of pressure from the DPE to accept these packages. So it's unacceptable that these workers have to exit SAA without a guarantee of when these packages will be paid to them.
Now, I want to ask you about two sets of communication coming out of SAA. We received many notes on our Facebook pages and in our inboxes and letters in our emails from SAA employees saying that they were being invited to headquarters to sign for the voluntary severance packages. But when they got there, they merely had to sign for the UIF and for their existing pensions. And there was no talk once they got to headquarters of the voluntary severance packages. Is this management by stealth? Now, the second question I have is the letter that was written by the SAA chairperson, Thandeka Mgoduso, bidding the employees who've opted for the scheme a very fond, lyrical, poetic farewell. What do you think of all of this?
I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And we have raised this very strongly with the BR team, which is working very closely with management, that we cannot rule by fear, because that's exactly what it is. They are saying to people, we don't know when we're going to pay your VSP. Go get your pension in the meantime while we try to sort ourselves out. And people are that desperate that they are opting for that, because what else do? You're not getting any assurance that the VSP money will be paid. You have not received a salary in the last 6 months. And I mean, it's desperate times. And for Thandeka Mgoduso, the chairperson of the board, to write that fairy letter is actually, I think it left a lot of people very insulted, because she was part of the looting of the corruption of the board. She was there to oversee the runnings of SAA and contributed very strongly to the demise of South African Airways. So now the very same management is sitting in their cushy positions. The bottom earner, the people that have not created this mess and have just come to work, are the ones that are suffering. So that letter was actually taken as an insult by the majority of our members.
Now, Phakamile, may I come to you over there on the phone? Phakamile, do you really believe that the 10.4 billion is forthcoming?
We really hope so. We really, really hope so, because there's a lot at stake here if it's not forthcoming. We're talking here more than 3,000 employees who will suddenly be left jobless. We'll be dealing with an airline which will officially be facing either liquidation or winding down. So we really, really hope that this time these are not just empty promises from DPE and Treasury, but that there is genuine action behind those words. This is not the first deadline that they've missed, and it's very hard for our members, given that there's been many assurances in the past and many failures in the past. The only thing that will convince them now is actually this money being made available. Nothing else will convince them.
Now, Phakamile, can you tell me, I have a sense that a lot of time has been wasted, and this has been very costly to the airline and to all the stakeholders involved, especially government. Between the time where the Jahana plan was on the table and the amounts of money that have been spent thus far, is it true that had the Jahana plan been implemented way back then, before he exited, we wouldn't be in this situation where a lot of money has been spent negotiating, hiring people, and so on?
Well, absolutely. This whole process was unnecessary. We have an airline which is viable. This is a viable airline. It's been destroyed by people who should know better, by the board that didn't care or enabled corruption, by executives who were deeply entrenched in corrupt activities, and by a shareholder that frankly was completely negligent in its responsibilities to employees and to the future of the airline. The money which government is giving to the airline now, why didn't they give Jahana the funding which he needed back then? We wouldn't be in this crisis that we're in now. And I mean, it's a fact that coronavirus was not the reason why SAA collapsed. It collapsed precisely because of massive looting and mismanagement that was taking place over a long period of time, plus the fact that instead of government actually investing in the airline and putting capital into the airline, government actually was signing off guarantees.
But
and those guarantees...
Isn't it true also that for many of the state-owned enterprises, the problem is the business model, that the business model rests on archaic and sometimes obsolete commercial conditions, and that many of these entities actually need new business models, and without that, government will be throwing money into a deep, dark hole?
Well, that is true. And I think it would depend on, you would have to analyze the type of business model. But also what is equally and crucially important is that that business model, regardless of what it is, even if it was the best business model designed by the best business person alive, if you have a corrupt board and an executive that doesn't have a clue what it's doing and an executive that is not working in the interest of the airline, then that airline will collapse. And that is precisely the problem that SAA is facing even now. After all that we've been through, we're still dealing with the same board under Thandeka Mgoduso that is responsible for the collapse of this airline. They are still continuing behind the scenes to pull the strings to further deepen the crisis of the airline. If you listen to, for example, the engagements that have been taking place in the Section 189, these executives are literally a law unto themselves. And there is nobody reining them in, not DPE, not the board. And
but
as
are
long
these
as
executives,
that is the case, how can we expect anything to change at SAA?
But Phakamile, are these executives and the board not just lame ducks at the stage, and that the business rescue practitioners and DPE are essentially running the entity at the moment?
No, that's not necessarily true. There are instances where you can definitely pinpoint the involvement of DPE and the BRP, but certainly the executives have been playing and pulling a lot of strings together with Thandeka Mgoduso and frustrating these processes. For example, during the Section 189 process, the executives are proposing that all workers should be retrenched, and that after they've been retrenched, then they will rehire them when the airline starts. I mean, that's just borderline fraud. There is a business rescue plan which was adopted by creditors, which clearly outlines the number of staff that the airline must start with. And here these executives are literally doing as they please. They've been wrapped on the knuckles by DPE in a letter for this behavior. But that's as far as it goes. There's no involvement by DPE to try and actually change the behavior of these executives. And this is why we're saying that they are a law unto themselves.
Now, what is the most likely future for the airline? What's the most favorable scenario in your opinion?
The most favorable scenario would be for the board to be replaced with a completely new board of people who have actual aviation experience and no history with SAA. It would involve an executive of competent people with aviation experience and, again, no history with SAA. That is absolutely crucial. That is the starting point. And then from there, we can actually start to see real progress when it comes to turning this airline around.
And may I go back to Zazi and ask Zazi, what do you think the future holds?
The future we have a lot of faith that it can be a bright one, on condition that, like Pagamile said, we have a management team. Actually, this management team should not be overseeing the Section 189 currently. This management team must excuse us and allow a brand new executive to take over, create a structure that is leaner and flatter, because what we're seeing in the proposals is the structure is extremely management bloated. It's highly bloated still. Obviously, because it's the same people that are negotiating their own positions. So we need a situation where we have a new management team that can run, the airline and put together a fit-for-purpose structure and take it out of the hands that are currently in charge. Because, I mean, if you asked earlier on, are the BRPs and the DPE working? No, it's management that has actually taken over the BRPs. In these processes, we are not seeing the BRPs participating. It's the executive management that is there, although the BRPs are in charge, but the same old executive management is running these processes. That needs to stop. And once that stops, the future of SAA can be very bright.
Let me just explain that the BRPs are the business rescue practitioners for our viewers. Now, I've heard that there is a preference in certain parts of the state and some parts of labor for the kind of business model that has SAA rising from the ashes as a new entity, but then that owns a number of other entities that would be supportive of a much wider, much broader, much more solid business plan. Similar to the one of Ethiopian Airlines, where the entity actually owns the airport, it owns many of the other input industries, and it's much more solid as a business future, because there are many streams of revenue that are possible to support the actual airline.
No, absolutely. With a good management team, that is very possible. I mean, look, we know about air chefs, and we know that cargo during this pandemic should have done extremely well, but unfortunately, once again, very badly managed. So we couldn't maximize what we could have made, like airlines like Ethiopian, who literally can negotiate prices and are more competitive because they are using their own service providers. We have SA Technical right now, which is sitting, which has been allowed to die by the very same, the board that run it. So absolutely, that is something that should happen. But where we need to start is by appointing the right people in the right positions. And right now, and let's have a little faith in South Africans. The current CEOs that have been appointed, from Philip Saunders to Adam Foss, they're not even in this country as we speak, and we're going through an extreme crisis. We need to really start to think about how we can maximize the talent that we have in this country. Use SAT, make it fit for purpose. Riane Jahana was here, and you were quite right. He had a plan which was backed by lenders that were willing to put money down, just with the promise of a guarantee. The DPE could not come through with a guarantee to assist him. So we are saying that SAA can be turned around. SAA Technical is a very good organizational subsidiary, which has tremendous potential, but just has the wrong management team. So we're insisting that that change before we even get a cent from government.
Now, beyond the technical solutions and the business models and the high-flown business talk, can you just tell us a little bit about the experiences of ordinary workers of SAA during this crisis?
Oh, it's been the worst time. And I think, when we listen to people talk and the sentiment of the general public, I mean, if you look at an ordinary cabin crew member or a ground staff member who has actually spent a lot of people that join SAA actually have made it their lifelong careers and have actually served for a very long time. And were hoping to retire, because they've given their all. When SAA was at the worst of worst, these are the people that used to apologize to customers, make sure that SAA flies high with the best cabin crew, although our resources, were challenged at times. And these are the very same people that are now out the door and are suffering. People have not received salaries for over 6 months. People's houses are being repossessed. People can't pay their school fees. It's really, really a dire situation. And when there's some sort of, glee that there's 3,000 people that have taken VSP, these people did not have a choice. They had fear because they did not know what next. Currently they don't know how to pay for what their debts that are accumulating. So it's dire. And it's a very, very sad day for this airline. And what people also need to remember is that SAA doesn't run alone as an airline. They have many, many service providers, an extremely high procurement spend, which if SAA collapses, those jobs will also collapse.
Well,
so people must really just, think broader than just this airline.
We certainly pray for good solutions to the SAA problem, because it is one of the national treasures. And on a day such as this one, we hope that the solutions can be in the interests of all stakeholders concerned. Now let's take a short break. Now, government is expected to honour a commitment it made last week to provide over 10 billion rand needed to save the national carrier from liquidation. Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan is confident that government will come up with the money this week, but SAA trade unions are not equally optimistic.
A question of trust, that's what it's all about, according to COSATU.
You will remember that a public servant signed a contract in 2018, and now government has reneged on that. So if government fails to actually fund this plan, where government committed itself to say it was going to do everything to honor this plan, then it will be a big problem for us, because we don't want to have a situation where we have a government that we cannot trust. Either the government is going to be trusted by workers and South Africans or not. But if they fail to actually come out with a funding model and put the money into the plan that we all collectively developed, then that it will be a problem.
SAA employees were last paid their salaries back in March. The airline's business rescue practitioners say the coffers have completely run dry.
For the last 4 months or more, our members at SAA have had no salaries. They've had to depend on the temporary employee relief scheme at UIF. And unfortunately, that money, it's a fraction of what most of our members are earning. And they're really struggling to survive. Their families have suffered extreme hardship as a result of this long delay in this process.
Of the 10 billion rand expected from the government, just over 2 billion will go towards paying around 3,000 workers voluntary severance packages. That will see ordinary workers getting around 350,000 rand each, while pilots are set to receive up to 2 million rand each. The rest of the money will be used to pay debts and to start a new, smaller national airline. Last week, Friday, creditors agreed to delay a decision on whether or not to liquidate SAA after the government made a last-minute written commitment to come up with the money during this week. Liquidation will be back on the agenda this coming Friday if the government fails to honor its commitment. Bongani Mucho, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now on the line we have COSATU spokesperson Sizwe Pamla. Now Sizwe, hi, thanks for joining us. Sizwe, it's been a SAFTU union, which is NUMSA, the biggest union inside SAFTU, that has been associated in the public eye with this strike and with the concerns at SAA. But COSATU has not been without its concern for what is happening at the entity. Can you explain where you come in and what your take on the situation is?
Well, firstly, we do have an affiliated union at South African Airways, which is the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, SATAU. But also, just as the biggest federation in the country, you'll remember that we have made it very clear that the issue of saving jobs is really our priority. If you look at what is happening at South African Airways, we were happy with the kind of collective effort that we saw amongst unions working with government and other stakeholders to really deal with the problems that have emerged at South African Airways. What is disappointing now is that while everybody came out of those engagements feeling very positive because there was some kind of a consensus and everybody had made some commitments, we are not now seeing government honoring the commitment that was made. And unfortunately, this is really making life difficult for workers because, number one, if you look at the aviation industry all across the world, there's a lot of consolidation, there are a lot of discussions that are taking place. And if we do not act on time, we're going to lose an opportunity to be able to restart this airline at the same time, looking for those equity partners. Because, for example, we have heard through the grapevine that airlines like Ethiopian Airlines have been looking at the South African Airways situation. And we would really like to have a public-public partnerships with those kinds of airlines. But if we do not start to do what is supposed to be done on our side, we're going to lose that opportunity to be able to engage with those people. Or some of them are just going to lose interest and move on. But having said that, the real issue here is that workers have been left on the ledge. The UIF Test Fund is unable to really sustain the expectations of those workers. Some of them are losing their homes, some of them are losing their assets, including their cars. And this is not acceptable when you consider the fact that there is a commitment that was made and that commitment now is not being honored.
Now, workers who have worked for close to 20 years are now losing their assets. This is really concerning when you consider that many of the other stakeholders like the government, DPE, as well as the SAA authorities are very reluctant to engage, even on an empathetic level, with the press about what is actually going on. So it leaves us hamstrung because we have to speak to unions and speak to affected workers, and we are seldom able to speak to the authorities or the official decision makers in this crisis. However, it's very interesting that you locate the future opportunities of SAA within the context of what's happening in the aviation industry globally. I understand that there are over 30 interested bidders. Do you have a little bird on the shoulder who has told you perhaps who among the 30 is an interesting prospect or an interesting marriage for SAA?
Well, the same problem that we are raising of a lack of communication is also what we are also dealing with. In fact, we have had to engage with the media to say, look, we do not want to speculate because people are talking about all sorts of things that are happening inside government, but no one is coming out to communicate with us. And we hope that that is going to change because it is not really helping anyone and it is not helping government itself because it is creating a lot of anxiety for workers and also social partners, because you want your government to be a reliable partner. You do not want a government that is not going to be trusted by its own people, especially people who are doing business with that government. So we do hope that the government is really going to improve its communication, not just with the public, but also with the stakeholders, because stakeholders need to be updated. But having said that, what we are also seeing here is that we have a national treasury, unfortunately, that took a very hardline position against South African Airways. You will remember that the national treasury really has been very indifferent as to the plight of South African Airways. On numerous occasions, they have expressed their views that they would rather see this airline die and disappear. So when we look at what is happening at government, we start to feel suspicious that what is happening is that all of the other relevant departments are trying their best. The problem is that those who hold the purse strings are really not committed to resuscitating South African Airways. And they are hoping that by delaying this, by frustrating this process, they are going to sabotage this revival of South African Airways. This is something that worries us because it will not be the first time that National Treasury really disregard a contract or a commitment that has been entered to with the South African government by social partners and stakeholders.
Now, you didn't answer my question about the potential marriage partners.
Look, like I said, necessarily have a list of those partners for now. But for us, we will prepare a public-public partnership. We have made it very clear. Of course, look, beggars can't be choosers in this situation. We will have to consider all of the partners, and everybody will have to be judged on their merit. But a public-public partnership for us is something that we will prefer, because if you look at the aviation industry just across the world, the most resilient airlines are actually run by governments. And in South Africa, as a developing economy, we need the aviation sector to really be a sector that is going to continue to thrive. And we cannot afford to actually shut down a sector that is so strategic in really running the South African economy. And we hope that we can partner with another public entity, whether it is from around the world or locally. But as we have said, everybody who wants to partner at this time, we hope that they will be judged on merit, and everybody will be open-minded in terms of engaging with those equity partners as soon as they have been announced, or as soon as we know who they are.
Now, COSATU has been in NEDLAC, and one of the dominant points in the NEDLAC economic recovery plan is SOE reform. What is it that COSATU is saying at NEDLAC about SOE reform that has bearing on the situation at SAA?
Well, what we have said is that, firstly, what is the plan? Because we've been told that National Treasury is working on a plan. You remember that government actually has been making a lot of commitments that there is a plan that is being hashed up, and that this plan will be presented to social partners for consideration and discussion. Now, what we want is to first see this plan so that we can engage with something that we know. That is what we've been asking them at NEDLAC, to say, where is this plan? Because our position is that, look, we agree some of these SOEs have to be merged. There's a lot of duplication. And if you look at the business model of some of these entities, we need to really revamp them. Some of them, they're using the kind of business model that is not going to be competitive going forward. And the funding model that we have used, we keep calling this model bailouts. It's actually not bailout. It is the model that we have used since after 1994, because all of these entities have been reliant on the state for funding. So we keep calling these bailouts, but that is the only available funding model that we have used for the last 2 decades. So if we're saying this is not sustainable, and we agree with that, let us then come out with a funding model that is going to make sense, that is going to be sustainable, that all of us will agree that it is something that we can all accept. But right now, no one is talking about where is this rationalization plan that we were promised of either reducing the number through measures or otherwise. Number 2, we don't know what is happening with the turnaround strategies. If you look at the Auditor General's report, it was lamenting that all of what we are seeing here is that the consultants are being given billions, but they are not really helping these entities to develop a sustainable turnaround plans, or actually effective turnaround plans. So there are no turnaround plans, and there is no funding model. So we are all waiting for the National Treasury that promised us in the last midterm budget policy statement that it was developing this plan. And President Cyril Ramaphosa himself appointed a team that was supposed to look at the fate of SOEs and present this to social partners. Without that, it would be difficult to really engage, because we need a plan in place so that we know what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much, Sizwe, for joining us this evening. That has been an enlightening conversation, especially where you talk about the constant bailouts being, in effect, the funding model over the last few years for several SOEs. Thank you very much for joining us. And now the Transport Minister, Minister Fikile Mbalula, has reiterated his call on the aviation industry to ensure that safety regulations are strictly adhered to as the economy further reopens. Mbalula is conducting a COVID-19 regulations compliance inspection at Cape Town International Airport ahead of the reopening of the international travel on October the 1st. Mbalula says the industry must ensure that employees and customers are safe. Now, he also did the dance of the day, the Jerusalem dance, and that's it from us on Economics Unbound. Till next week, goodbye. Khonantini Mawit.
We said our airlines are fitted with HEPA because in terms of the seating arrangement, you don't have a social distance inside the airlines. And the HEPA is assisting us to eat the virus from inside. And that is what it has actually done. So Poppy Koza was here together with a team, and everybody else understands what we are doing to fight the spread of coronavirus in the airlines. And it does not mean that coronavirus cannot catch you, but we do minimize. But those who are scientists and who are advising us are saying the safest space in terms of corona transmission, it is the airline. But should you have symptoms of coronavirus inside the airline, we are able to deal with that upon disembarkation and embarkation. And that is why in all our airports, before you open up an airport, you must have port health. You cannot just come into the airport and you are not being checked. In all ways, you are actually being checked. So that is what we are doing in terms of our measures. What you will not see inside the airline is this thing called sanitizer, because the airline has got flammable substances on board. So when you get inside, don't ask for sanitizer, because you won't get it. But you must put on your mask for 2 hours to Johannesburg and coming back to Cape Town. All the time, put on your mask. I can see people in areas of entertainment, they've forgotten the masks. They are dancing like corona is no more. I saw somebody on social media saying, I've survived corona. I'm celebrating. It's not yet over. It's not yet over. Corona is still with us. We are now learning to live with corona. That's what we are doing. Yeah, Shamila is calling us and is giving us problems here. So we are living with corona in the new normal alongside corona, and to live alongside corona, there are measures you've got to undertake. And those who gather en masse and they are drinking alcohol are the most vulnerable and susceptible to the spread and transmission, because there is no care. People don't put on masks. They don't care about what happens in their surrounding. So we need to be careful about that. We are easing down because South Africa has always balanced its approach to creation of livelihoods and fighting the virus. And it is Heritage Day today, and we're opening up. And as we're opening up, this airport, Dion, is going to be very busy. You have been talking to me that, Minister, when are you coming to Cape Town? I've got no doubt you are doing an excellent job here, Dion, in Cape Town. So we are here to do that check and to affirm and to also celebrate yourselves who have been in the front line in this airport, doing a marvelous job, ensuring that we are safe, and by first protecting yourselves.